Hello, and welcome to Wallace's Mysteries of Antiquity. Subscribe to the channel to join me in exploring the enigmas of our distant ancestors and try to come to tentative conclusions about them. My apologies for this video taking so long. Sometimes videos just take a few months. The Black Pyramid video did because of a desert of information that I had to go find, but in this project I had the opposite problem. If you go through my sources, you'll notice, well, first, that there's a lot of them. And here's one of the more important ones from Mark Lehner. And yes, that does say 534 pages. I read it all. He's written some long books before, but those were for public consumption. This is a PhD dissertation. It's pure information, as densely packed as it could get. As always, you can look here in the corner for a reference ID for this particular slide. Out of all of the ancient wondrous things in Egypt, none, with the possible exception of the Great Pyramid, have captured the imagination to the extent of the Sphinx. And because of this, I believe that it has become one of them with the muddiest information about it. I wanted to correct that. So this video is everything about the Sphinx. We'll talk about what the ancient people and Middle Ages people thought of it, its exploration and rediscovery, the evidence for its age, and all of the holes inside of it. I'll even show you pictures of its supposedly secret chamber within its butt. You'll get a cover-up conspiracy that's real, and some drilling that's never been officially documented before. Organizing all of this has been a mess. There is just so much information and so much that's happened here. I determined the best way to present the story of the Sphinx to you is in chronological order. So that not only will you know, for example, that Howard Weiss dug a borehole into its back, you'll have an idea of the thinking at the time. If, in the early part of the video, you find yourself wondering, how could we possibly know what I just said? Well, that'll probably come in the sections of the 19th through 21st centuries. This video is the complete history of the Sphinx. Everything that has ever happened here. Okay? Ready? Buckle up. Let's go. Around 56 million years ago, you heard that right. Did you think I was kidding when I said everything? 56 million years ago, what would become the Giza Plateau was under a shallow sea, maybe 50 to 100 feet of water. We know this because fossils are everywhere in Giza, and most show things like shellfish and small crustaceans. We don't find much plant life, so we can assume it was just too deep for that, but still well within the rich coastal biome. If you visit Egypt, look closely at the stone around you, and you'll see starfish, sand dollars, sea urchins embedded in the ground, even the pyramids. I've shown you several prominent ones in random videos, but when looking closely, you'll spot them literally everywhere. Pick a random block from any Giza pyramid, and you can probably find a fossil in it. In the past, this was used as evidence of the biblical flood, and you'll still occasionally hear people saying this. Called the Tethys Sea, it laid down several layers of sediment over the next 20 million years. We would eventually come to know these layers as Member 1, 2, and 3, and the Sphinx itself would be carved out of this seabed by creatures that still won't exist for another 32 million years. The head of the Sphinx specifically is entirely covered in the fossils of Operculilla pyramidum, which are the shells of single-cell marine organisms that went extinct about 34 million years ago. So we can assume the sedimentary formation of the bedrock was laid down before this time. All of the fossils in these images are from the Khafre quarry. If you're wondering, the name is from the shape of the shell, not the pyramids. Over the next 25 million years, the Giza region would get pushed upwards by the tectonic processes and Africa itself flip-flopped between being arid and wet, and mammals flourished. Around 6 million years ago, two important things happened. First, the Strait of Gibraltar closed, and the Mediterranean was cut off from the Atlantic. As the water started to evaporate, the salt got stuck behind, and it absolutely devastated the ecosystem. This was given the name the Messinian Salinity Crisis. The other thing that happened around this time that's relevant to the story of the Sphinx happened in Central Africa, when two groups of hominids interbred for the last time. One of these groups would become chimpanzees, and the other was set on a path to becoming us. A little more than 5 million years ago, the tectonics once again lowered the Strait of Gibraltar, and what would have started as a trickle quickly eroded a channel, unleashing the entire Atlantic back into the Mediterranean basin all at once, in what's known as a Zanclean flood. I don't think any of our ancestors saw it. There's no evidence of them being that far north yet, but it would fill the Mediterranean again to a much higher point than it today relative to Giza. Well, that's actually a misnomer, and I'm actually not sure why it's always said that way. The sea level wasn't significantly higher. Giza was lower. These cliffs on the side of Giza were carved by this supposedly higher Mediterranean over the next million years, as it was the ancient shoreline. I would bet that currents in the area stripped away some of the top rocks, exposing small rocky outcrops. One of them would eventually be the Sphinx. As the Mediterranean receded from the cliffs and exposed more of the limestone, the first ancestors of us to gaze on what would be the Sphinx probably just saw a small rock jutting up from the sea off the ancient coast. Homo erectus probably passed this region on their way out of Africa. Then finally, at the dawn of the human species, the Mediterranean receded to more or less its current level. But for most of our existence, the Sphinx is just a piece of rock jutting up from the landscape, an Inselberg. It's likely humans camped out under it many times. We do tend to congregate around landmarks, and even without being shaped, it was likely one of the obvious and well-known large rocks by the locals. It'd be close to the Nile, but without being in the territory of the hippos and crocodiles. So I find it likely there have been many campsites for the entirety of human prehistory. To be clear, the only part that was actually sticking up was the part that would become the head. The rest of it was created by actually cutting down. But in prehistory, did they carve a head a little? Maybe. We can't really know. But that is something that humans just kind of do. If a stone looks like something, people will occasionally reinforce that with their own touches, particularly children. After speed running through prehistory, we have to stop at the first king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Narmer. This is because of a video ancient architects made 6 years ago, where he makes the proposal that this is the earliest depiction of the Sphinx. He actually talks about 2 depictions of it in his video from different time periods, and it'll make more sense if I tell you about the later one first. While looking for old depictions of the Sphinx, I came across his video about a UFO landing on the back of it. This papyrus will give you some important context about how the Sphinxes were actually viewed by the ancients. Ancient architects did call it out as bullshit, and he said it's a lotus flower, then explained what a fan made of them represented. It's just plain commonly associated with royalty, and sometimes sphinxes. But he did miss one other crucial detail. This was an old video of his, so let's cut him some slack. His views on all of this have changed dramatically since then. But he seemed to be under the impression that any depiction of sphinxes was the Sphinx. It's a sphinx, but not the one at Giza. Sphinxes were an entire species of magical creature in their religion, not to be confused with a similar creature in Greek mythology, where the name actually comes from, but more analogous to a type of angel in the Abrahamic religions. Context is important, and this papyrus was part of funerary goods of a priest, and is laid out almost like a storybook with scenes flowing in a particular order, and shows the dead priest's journey to the afterlife. So what clues are there that this is not the Sphinx? It's literally labeled. Quote, Osiris, priest of Amen, Jida Kanso, the justified one in the netherworld, end quote. The Sphinx is the deceased himself. In this part, he's waiting throughout the night in this form to join Ra at daybreak, which is depicted in the next scene where he transforms into this Ba bird and joins Ra in the sky, again labeled, quote, Ra, he rests in life, end quote. Ancient Architects then further explains that ancient depictions of the Sphinx are quite rare, and when they do happen, they almost always seem to have had a fan on its back. He theorized if the Giza monument once had a fan on its back. But again, none of the examples that he showed actually depicted the Sphinx. This is Amenhotep I and II. The fan is associated with the king, not the Sphinx. When there is a fan on a Sphinx, it means that that particular Sphinx is or was a king. Sorry if it feels like I'm ragging on Ancient Architects, but he's a prominent communicator, and I've heard this next particular piece of information spread well beyond his video, so I wanted to address it. He interprets this plate showing Narmer conquering Lower Egypt and believes this may show him holding the Sphinx captive, using it as a symbol for the subjugation of the lower civilization. Narmer and Horus do appear to be holding a Sphinx captive, but again, I believe he is misunderstanding the order of events being shown. This is a progression over time. I believe this part depicts Narmer slaying the king of Lower Egypt. Then the king slips into the afterlife, at which point he takes the form of a Sphinx, who is then intercepted by Narmer's divine ally Horus, who denies the former king access to divinity, legitimizing Narmer as the sole divine ruler. The transformation of a dead person to a Sphinx as their early steps to their journey to divinity seems very well established in multiple dynasties, and to me, what Ancient Architects shows clearly depicts that. The fan on the back represents that this is a king, and the Sphinx just indicates that he's dead, and Horus indicates his denial to divinity and Narmer's favor with the gods. Again, a Sphinx, but not the Sphinx. There are no depictions of the Sphinx until much, much later. We're going to jump ahead, but we're going to stop again in the time of Khufu to dispel more myths. You may have heard stories that even the Egyptians claimed the Sphinx predated the pyramids, and perhaps that Khufu found the Sphinx already at Giza. That claim comes from an item called the inventory stela, and it's a complete lie. The stela was created by the Sates around 550 BC, and seems to have been trying to legitimize the ancientness of the Temple of Isis. Maybe there were stories handed down that got confused over time. Maybe they just completely made it up. But the author certainly seemed to have an agenda that was not historical accuracy. Furthermore, it's claiming the Sphinx and 22 other statues as belonging to an ancient temple of Isis that Khufu found. But there are no mentions of Isis in the religion before the 5th dynasty. Our diary of Murrer, who traveled past Giza many times during the life of Khufu, never mentions the Sphinx or anything analogous to it or a temple of Isis. The weathering on the quarry around the Sphinx has been a matter of contention for a while now, and various serious academic proposals have been made aging the cut section to over 10,000 years old, including by geologists. However, modern geological surveys and analysis of the erosion patterns have all mostly agreed that the quarry cannot be older than the Old Kingdom. Night Scarab recently completed a fantastic video on the erosion patterns, and I'd recommend that for a deep dive into that specific feature of this monument. He outlines the problems with all of the theories pushing it far back in time, and explains some of the things that we see here. I'll explain exactly how I think these features were formed in a short bit too. If you think you're subscribed to Night Scarab, you're probably not. Something happened to his channel recently where it got privated. I'm not sure what and don't want to speculate, but go resubscribe to him, and if you're not subscribed to him before, check him out. You might like him. But for now, Pharaoh Khafre is almost certainly the man responsible for the first commissioning of the Sphinx. His workers carved a series of terraces around the Sphinx, creating the U-shaped section that it sits in. Many of the stones pulled from here went directly into creating Khafre's Valley Temple, and then some to the Sphinx Temple, which sat on a terrace in front of the body. You may notice there are two Sphinx temples. The one with the arrow is the one made by the Old Kingdom. I will reference the others in the future, so let's get your bearings now. This one is the New Kingdom Temple, and this one is the Valley Temple of Khafre, with the causeway leading up to his Pyramid Temple. You might be wondering, why Khafre? The Sates claimed Khufu found it, and there isn't any writing on it from the Old Kingdom. Maybe the face kinda looks like him, but is there hard evidence? This is unambiguously Khafre's temple, and strata analysis proves some of the stones that make it up were quarried from the Sphinx enclosure, directly in front of the chin, actually. So the ancients were cutting down the bedrock around the Sphinx and using it to make the Khafre and Sphinx temples in rapid succession. It's possible parts of Khafre's causeway was also constructed from stones quarried from the Sphinx. Save that thought for a few slides. Let's now actually use this opportunity to look at the face of the Sphinx. Who is this? Late Europeans believed it was a woman. The New Kingdom seemed to think it might be Khufu. Some have proposed it's the gods Hepe or Ra, but all the scientific dating points to Khafre. I ran an experiment on a bunch of social media sites. I showed a bunch of artists the Sphinx, and then statues of 5 men I thought it might be. These are not Egypt fan people like us, and they have no idea who is who or even who the Sphinx was supposed to be. But they have a really good understanding of the subtleties of the human face from drawing and sculpting it, and they did have an overall favorite. The most common response was Gizamedia, and the second was Khafre. I think it's possible the color of the Gizamedia head may have added some small influence and bias, but considering these men are brothers, I think it's fairly conclusive that this is probably the face of Khafre. But could it be his older brother Gizamedia? He had a short reign, then seemed to die young. Khafre was never meant to be king. Perhaps his brother started the Sphinx, and Khafre finished it in his honor. Khafre didn't complete his pyramid, which was not at Giza, which in my opinion eliminates him as a potential creator, but perhaps this was a brotherly concession. Perhaps Khafre started it for his brother. Without text, I can't suppose we'll ever know, as they simply look too much alike. Either of them seem possible to me to be the Sphinx. Honoring his brother may have placated some of the elites hoping for a long to Khafre rule, and it wouldn't actually add that much work, because they were going to quarry this area anyway to make Khafre's temple. They weren't really building the Sphinx, they were just quarrying down around it. Everything else, the head, could be done with a small team of sculptors, a drop in the bucket compared to the pyramid project right next door. The headdress is unequivocally of the 4th Dynasty Nemes design, according to Rainer Straterman, who suggested Khufu, as is the beard. I've seen Egyptologists quibble over exactly which headdress this is, but they're in agreement that it's all about the correct one for Khafre. And furthermore, the Nemes headdress solidifies that this is the image of a king and not a god. Khafre was also probably the most prolific statue builder of ancient Egypt, at least until the New Kingdom. There were counted 58 large statues within his complex, not including the Sphinx. While, unfortunately, many of them did not make it to today, their anchor points and other evidence for their existence is well documented. Though it seems like Khafre may have died before the Sphinx temple was completed. In fact, the entire project seemed to have been abandoned shortly after the pyramid was done. You can see the intent here to case the entire temple in granite, but it was never done. These stones weren't robbed. There's no evidence they ever existed. You probably think of the Sphinx as this majestic symbol of Egypt, like it is today. But they didn't see it that way, at least not the Old Kingdom. We see evidence that once a king died, the previous king's projects and tombs were hastily finished up so that the workers could focus on the new king's projects. This was true for pyramids and their associated temples, and is why we often get what seems like half-assed temples and wall construction next to the highest quality royal tombs. And this is another reason why I associate the Sphinx specifically with Khafre, because Menkaure didn't seem to care about it enough to finish the temples. When Khafre died, it seemed construction of the temple in front of it and the quarrying and carving of the Sphinx ceased, and it lay abandoned, possibly in a partially finished state for 1,000 years. Hardly the regal symbol of Egypt. Chemical analyses in the 20th century would be able to tell exactly where the stones making up the temple came from, and they're from all different parts of the enclosure, indicating they were likely slowly building it while focusing on the main Khafre temple first, which we know they never finished. I propose a lot of the weathering on the outer edge of the quarry happened during this time. The enclosure likely filled with sand, as well as organics. That trapped organic topsoil slightly acidified any rainwater, which eats limestone. Night Scarab pointed out that the V-shapes are indications of flowing water, but these crisscross patterns are not how water erodes rock. But this is how wet rock will slowly dissolve if constantly supplied with fresh carbonic acid from rainwater seeping through topsoil, then getting brought up against the wall through capillary action, which held water against the stone potentially for days or weeks after a rainstorm in wet sand. The body itself seems slightly less eroded than the outer edges of the terraces. It's likely because the outer wall was not touched since the time of Khafre, but the actual polishing and final form of the Sphinx wasn't produced until 1,000 years later. To be honest, I find erosion patterns to just be too wishy-washy. The error bars are too big. Look at this. These were quarried from the same place and have had the same conditions applied to them for their time exposed, and they look completely different from each other. Before moving on from the time of Khafre, I do want to make it clear that while I strongly believe the Sphinx to be the work of Khafre and Khafre alone, there is plenty of room for interpretation. For example, History for Granite lays out several pieces of evidence for the Sphinx predating Khafre, besides the erosion. I won't address them all and recommend viewing his video to see how much room there really is for interpretation. He does point out that the Khafre Pyramid Temple is the only one in the Old Kingdom that does not meet the causeway at the center, and proposes this is to make it straight and to avoid the pre-existing Sphinx. He also then points out, of course, that the Khufu quarry is right there, and that could be the reason, which is my belief. There is plenty of room for interpretation, but we all kind of agree that it happened during the reign of Khufu, Djedefre, or Khafre. I was also actually curious about the lines on the headdress early in my research, enough so to ask Reddit, as I only really remembered seeing flat faces. But this seems fairly common in statues, and I believe the lines would have been painted on flat ones, but they do occasionally appear carved in Old Kingdom statues. Here is Djoser from before Khafre and Pepe from after him. I think the lines were added in the Sphinx because it was easier on the much larger stone, where cutting them in smaller statues may have eventually weakened or broken the sculpture. They could have also been carved by later kingdoms. But then after Khafre, we face a mystery. Fine stone temple walls that might reference the Sphinx were definitely stolen ages ago. But there are 300 years of tombs at Giza that happened after the Sphinx was completed, some of which were found completely untouched, and there isn't a single reference to the Sphinx. It just seems like the Egyptians of the 5th and 6th dynasties didn't care about the Sphinx, because these walls did show priests, gods, and the 3 main pyramids. Was it even finished at this point, or was it just an excavation with the vague shape of what it would become? A lot of those 5th and 6th dynasty burials were actually relatives of the king or high-ranking members of the Khafre family lineage. So there didn't really seem to be any major political shakeups between the dynasties, and they seem to maintain the Khafre temple complex, but it's not clear if the Sphinx was included in that. That's because the Sphinx was receiving invasive burials during this time on the north wall of the outer amphitheater. There are a number of Old Kingdom burials in the wall of the Sphinx complex. I was not able to find a picture of them. The one I'm showing you is an unrelated Old Kingdom invasive burial for context. But there are also New Kingdom burials up higher, but nothing from in between. Like nothing. After the 6th dynasty, ancient Egyptian activity around Giza basically ceased. No new constructions were added, the cemetery was abandoned, and there is no evidence of occult presence in the Middle Kingdom. The only real thing that happened here was the robbing of the valuable stones from the temple and the Sphinx, but this was actually happening already by the 5th dynasty. In the 18th dynasty, we're not really sure why, but suddenly the Sphinx became popular again, and was being given the name Horemakhet, Horus of the Horizon. This is around the reign of Amenhotep I. This appears to be an entirely New Kingdom name for it, the original likely lost to the centuries of neglect. It also now seemed to be associated more with the sun, although that may have always been the case. But the next major event regarding the Sphinx wouldn't happen for 1,000 years after Khafre. The king was Amenhotep II, and it was under his rule that it received its New Kingdom mud brick temple, and the Sphinx was dug out, freed from its sandy prison. Remember when I said to keep in mind that Khafre used some of the stones he cut out of the Sphinx enclosure to build his causeway? That's coming to roost now, because ironically, the New Kingdom was taking blocks from the dilapidated causeway to now finish the Sphinx. I believe it's likely that all of this was at the request of his son, who would become Pharaoh Thutmose IV. He is named on the dream stela, which I'm showing you, and it talks about the young prince. This is him making an offering to it. It says that while still prince, Thutmose fell asleep at the paws of the Sphinx, which is weird if they were buried, but anyway. He did not call it Khafre. However, he does acknowledge Khafre as the creator, showing the early part of the New Kingdom still seem to know this. Instead, the priest claims the Sphinx itself as a god. Quote, "Behold thou me, my son Thutmose. I am thy father, Horamhenket Kapara Ra Atum. I will give thee my kingdom upon the earth at the head of the living." End quote. The Sphinx seems to be promising the young prince the crown. Quote, "Thou shalt wear the white crown and the red crown upon the throne of Jeb, the hereditary prince. The land shall be thine, in its length and in its breadth, that which the eye of the All-Lord shines upon." End quote. The Sphinx almost seems to be directly commanding the prince to restore him by freeing his limbs from the sand. Quote, "My face is directed to you. My heart is to you. Thou shalt be to me the protector of my affairs, because I am ailing in all of my limbs. The sands of the sanctuary upon which I am have reached me. Turn to me in order to do what I desire. I know that thou art my son, my protector. Behold, I am with thee. I am thy leader." End quote. I think it's reasonable to take this dream sequence literally, but keep in mind that it could be entirely made-up propaganda. But I think it's possible that Thutmose really did have this dream, and it really did influence his fascination with the Sphinx as well as his father's. The cartouche of Khafre has chipped away, but multiple drawings of it show that this has happened in the last 100 years. Fun fact, hieroglyphics can be written either left to right or right to left. I look for a person or animal to identify the direction easily, like this bird. You read into the direction of the face of it. The dream stela is one of those where both are used for symmetry. The left side, you read left to right, like us. On the other side is reversed. Random tangent. This painting is somewhat mysterious. No one is really sure what it's supposed to be depicting, but it was painted by Elihu Vedder in 1863. The dream stela was found in 1818 and had already been translated. The title of the work implies that the man is asking the Sphinx a question, but I wonder if this is supposed to be Thutmose's dream. But why would the Sphinx be telling Thutmose he would rule all of Egypt? His father was king. If he was the heir, he would have already been expected to take the reins upon the death of his father. Unless he wasn't the crown prince. There were 3 other stelae found that are now unfortunately lost that were said to have shown 3 other sons of Amenhotep II making offerings to the Sphinx with their names carefully removed. The earliest dynasties were absolutely a firstborn male succession civilization. But by the Middle Kingdom, that was less the norm and was more likely to have a crown prince selected by the king, as opposed to just defaulting to the eldest, even though it was usually the eldest. They were often given some divine reason for the ascension, and perhaps that had happened. Perhaps the dream itself was real and was the influencing factor. Perhaps Amenhotep was the one who actually had the dream, and the story was changed later. This mummy is Thutmose IV, by the way. But it's also very possible that there's something dark here. It's not uncommon for younger princes to usurp their way up to the crown. And even when the crown is acquired, it's common to eliminate the others because they can lead coups or be installed as acceptable replacements. Kim Jong-nam was the firstborn of Kim Jong-il, but was already basically exiled from North Korea when his younger brother became dictator. He was murdered anyway, so Un couldn't be deposed and swapped out with his brother, which, not the most paranoid thing he's done. Nam did seem to have some ties to the CIA. The dream stela was placed at the chest of the Sphinx by Thutmose IV, in what's said to be his first year as king. This implies to me that his father had completed its uncovering, and Thutmose would complete the renovations. Thutmose, at very least, had several mud brick walls erected to try and help prevent the sands from filling them back in. Workers' marks on the back side of them say he was king then. I did ask myself, would Thutmose IV be so bold as to put his own face on the Sphinx? Although I ran all of these through a facial matching software, I didn't expect much, both because it's a statue, not a person, and it and everything I'm comparing to have damage, but we can take a look at the percentages for completeness. Khufu I didn't bother with because this figurine's so small. Menkore was the worst match at 18%, both Khafre and Khafre scored 20%, and Thutmose IV scored a 33% match. I don't find any of those values significant. Even though Thutmose had the highest score, it's still way too low to be useful. But I included it because I'm sure someone else would have this idea. I also think it's unlikely. If the Dream Stela and restoring the Sphinx was a project meant to help legitimize the young prince nobody expected to be king, replacing the face would likely be seen as an affront by the very people he needs to legitimize him. So no, I don't think Thutmose changed the face, other than to maybe touch it up and maybe add the lines now. Once restored, the new kingdom began to revere Giza again, and all sorts of people started making offerings to the Sphinx. Thutmose's grandson, King Tutankhamun, added some structures, one of which seemed to have been a hunting lodge of sorts, as did Ramses II, as well as inscriptions by King Ai, Horemheb, Seti I, and Maranta. This Sphinx is Tut himself. But it wasn't just kings and priests. In 1936-38, Barres uncovered prayers and offerings from people from all walks of life. Military, builders, scribes, and just regular commoners asking for help in their day-to-day lives. Strangely, at least in the early New Kingdom, while the Sphinx itself was restored and becoming revered, the pyramids and the kings associated with them did not seem to get the same treatment. There is little to no evidence of the early New Kingdom giving the pyramids or the kings who built them a second thought. You even seem to find people coming to the Sphinx who were categorically not Egyptians. No less than 19 of the small private stelae referred to the Sphinx as Horon, which wasn't an Egyptian god, but a Semitic god of caves and the desert. The earliest of which also included the name Amenhotep II, but most came from the 19th dynasty. These Semites were likely Syrians and Canaanites who saw their own god in the Great Monument. These were likely captives from the wars of Thutmose III, or at least the descendants of them, as the city, now known as Memphis, started to become a core administrative and military hub, and was starting to have a lot of foreigners coming and going. We also start to see some influence of Osiris and Isis at this time. As far back as the Dream Stela, people had been calling the area around the Sphinx Rasta, which is the same name given to the tunnels of the underworld in the domain of Osiris. This association with these gods gets stronger the further into the New Kingdom you go. Remember that Osiris is the father of Horus in the Egyptian religion, so there would have always been a religious association here, but now it's getting more explicit. By the 26th dynasty, Isis was one of the most prominent gods in the religion, and a great temple was constructed for her. It's possible this was an 18th dynasty temple, but either way, the 26th dynasty did major work on it, and oh boy, some propaganda happened here. This is the inventory stela, also known as the stela of Khufu's daughter. I mentioned it when we stopped at the time of Khufu, because this is where that claim that Khufu found both the Sphinx, called House of Homokes in this text, and the Isis temple. They lied. Or maybe they didn't know. The 26th dynasty rulers were not Egyptians. They were Persians, and this entire section of history is known as the Sate period. That name likely sounds familiar, as they did a lot of renovation in Giza. Rewriting history is a common way for foreign rulers to legitimize themselves. See why I thought it best to go chronologically? It's often wondered why Herodotus never mentioned the Sphinx when he visited in the 27th dynasty, or around 480 BC. Some claim it's evidence that it wasn't even there yet, but you're 40 minutes into a video showing that's clearly wrong. He certainly must have seen it, as he claims to have personally walked around the Khafre pyramid to measuring it. Considering the stela and other things found in the Sphinx, we know it certainly wasn't covered in sand yet. Perhaps local superstitions caused the Egyptians themselves to start becoming hush about it with foreigners. Because when Pliny the Elder visited around 50 BC, he says that although the Egyptians were happy to show him and climb all over the pyramids, they brush off requests about the Sphinx itself. He claims the locals believe it to be a god, and that King Harmes was buried inside. We're not entirely sure who King Harmes is supposed to have been, but appears to be just a legend, as no other sources from any point in history mention a burial. It's possible they were referring to King Amesis I and II from the 18th and 26th dynasties, respectively. Not really sure why the locals would have thought that, as both of their burial locations are known to archaeologists. Maybe one of the invasive burials from the New Kingdom was some unknown short-ruled local king during some unrest, but personally I think it was a myth that they made up. Pliny does give us a very nice clue about the look of the Sphinx, though. The face was red, claimed to be painted with ruddle, which is a type of red ochre paint. This picture I found shows the body red, but that's not what Pliny says, just the face. The Ptolemies seem to have a great deal of reverence for the Sphinx as a concept, and made many small sphinxes with both lion heads and their own heads. But we don't see a lot of evidence for them around Giza. By the height of the Roman Empire, after conquering Egypt, Giza was sort of like it is today, a tourist attraction. We're fairly certain it was maintained during this time and was likely uncovered, at least mostly. Roman emperors such as Nero and Claudius are recorded as having visited, although they did not give an account of the event. A stele of Bucyrus implies Claudius found it covered and he dug it out again. At very least, they created this grand staircase and paved the floor of the area. The floor of the Sphinx today, all the way up to the paws, is actually Roman, not Egyptian. But the sands in the hourglass of time kept falling, and the Roman Empire eventually collapsed, leaving a power vacuum that wouldn't truly be refilled in Egypt until the Middle Ages. The Roman staircase and the Sphinx once again started to be covered in sand. The early Christians largely ignored the Sphinx, but I believe they borrowed much more from Greek mythology about a similar creature than from the Egyptians, as this is when we see it start being associated with riddles and such. The Greek influence over Christianity is everywhere. The white-bearded depiction of Jesus is literally a reappropriated Zeus, so when they encountered the Sphinx in Egypt, they pulled from Greek myth. I believe this is likely where the belief that the Sphinx was a woman came from, as in Greek mythology they usually had female heads. The early Arabs and Muslims, of course, borrowed from the Christians, as well as incorporated their own mythology, although usually they saw it as the protector of the pyramids. While you'll often hear the myth that Napoleon shot the nose off of the Sphinx with a cannon, there is no evidence for that whatsoever, and it almost was certainly missing its nose and beard by the first few centuries AD. I'm about to show you a variety of drawings from before Napoleon, and you'll see the nose is already gone. The missing beard would explain how a female form was starting to be seen as well, though you can still see the outline of where it belonged. There is local folklore that a Sufi Muslim ordered the defacing of the Sphinx because people were bringing gifts to it, which he interpreted as blasphemous. But this particular Muslim who did this has never been named. Mark Lehner concluded that rods of some kind were hammered into the nose from the side to remove it on purpose sometime between the 2nd and 10th centuries. Probably less than a century after the fall of the Roman Empire, I suppose it likely the terraces of the Sphinx got filled with sand. It happened quickly. Even today, there is a steady supply of sand being pulled out by the Ministry of Antiquities. It would get the occasional curious visitor, but like before, it was abandoned, left to decay and be covered up by the sands of the desert, with only its head sticking up to breathe for over 1,000 years. We're going to basically skip the Middle Ages, as the local views didn't evolve much, and Europeans forgot about it. The very first drawing that I could find of the Sphinx comes from 1556 by André Tevet and is this. I don't think this guy actually saw the Sphinx, and I think he's likely going off of a description of it. Interesting, because this is clearly a Greek man. In 1572, we get a stylized map of Egypt from Hagenberg and Braun, which show the head of the Sphinx as what seems to be a Greek woman. There appears to be people in this drawing either worshipping the Sphinx or worshipping at it. In 1591, a Jan Sommer visited Egypt and made this drawing. I'm not sure if that head behind the pyramid is intended to be the Sphinx or not, particularly because this is obviously meant to show the Great Pyramid. Notice the little window on the top, that's the exit of the King's Chamber shaft. In 1610, George Sandys visited Giza, and 5 years later, he published this drawing of him approaching on horseback. Again, he attributes the head to a woman. Quote, "Not far off from these the Colossus doth stand, wrought altogether into the form of an Ethiopian woman, and adored heretofore by the country people as a rural deity." End quote. Perhaps that indicates the people in the map really were worshipping the Sphinx itself. Sandy's drawing also seems to show us that the nose was already missing. In 1653, we get a French explorer, François de la Boulaye-Legault. They clearly also believed the Sphinx to be the head of a woman with Greek features. Notice how the headdress is interpreted as her hair. I love looking at how the old drawings progress over time. In 1665, we get another Frenchman, Balthazar de Massanas, who provided this, that is clearly intended to be the Sphinx in the top left, and appeared in Les Voyages de Balthazar de Massanas. I can't tell if that's a man or a woman, but once again the headdress is seen to be the hair. 1665 was a big year because we also get an Ulfert Dapper drawing. I believe that head likely is meant to be the Sphinx in front of the largest pyramid. But you guys seeing that? There is a much more Sphinx shape towards the river that's completely uncovered. Why does he seem to show two? Was there a small, complete statue somewhere at Giza once? Rounding out the 17th century, in 1698, Cornelis de Broglie gave us this, which is a much more skilled drawing with some nice shading and realistic perspective. It also appears to show a damaged but still partially remaining nose. Moving forwards in time to 1724, Johann Baptista Haumann gave us an artistic interpretation of the Giza Plateau. Here the Sphinx is looking out over the Nile, and seems again to have a second one in it. But I think this one's artistic flair, as there's also way more pyramids here than there actually are or ever were. But the head seems to be sticking out more than in the 1600s. Then, in 1734, we get an interesting account of a Charles Thompson Esquire. Quote, "Before I leave this place, I must take notice of a colossus, at least the head of one. It is usually called a sphinx, which is a fabulous monster, having the head and breasts of a woman, the wings of a bird, the claws of a lion, and the body like a dog. They likewise made use of it in their hieroglyphics to represent a harlot, imitating the danger of being captivated by the charms of a faithless woman, whom the fond lover in the end finds as cruel and rapacious as a lion." End quote. Interesting, again, that it's referred to as a woman, and not just a woman, but a harlot. It's also interesting that claws and a body are mentioned, but he only said that he saw the head, and seemed to think that was it. In the rest, he is simply describing the Greek mythical creature for his reader. As for the Sphinx and hieroglyphics, they could not yet decipher hieroglyphics, and had no idea what the lion represented. Ironically, it actually means honor when it's by itself, and as a phonetic it makes an L sound, like here in Cleopatra. A Danish captain, Frederik Louis Norden, drew this in 1744, showing us the shoulders and upper torso were in fact visible, but it looks like the paws still had 10 meters of sand over them. He also clearly shows us that the nose is missing before Napoleon arrived. This is also a Norden drawing. Very accurate. Look, it even has the little niche in the side of the head that we think had something to do with the beard. We know that in the 1750s, Thomas Shaw saw the back of the Sphinx, telling us that while the head is what was usually visible, there were times when the sands naturally subsided enough to see other parts of it. He talks about a small cavity in his back, the first mention of it. Quote, "The sands were so far raised and accumulated about it that we could only discover the back of it, upon which, over the rump, there was a square hole, about 4 feet long and 2 abroad, so closely filled with sand that we could not lay it open enough to observe whether it had been originally contrived for the admission of fresh air, or, like the well in the Great Pyramid, was intended for a staircase." End quote. While this is the first mention of a small hole, the idea that the Sphinx had rooms seemed to have persisted for a while, as John Greaves contemplates an underground connection between it and the Great Pyramid in 1646. My wife pointed out how phallic the first image looks, so now you have to see it too. In 1790, we get this fantastic painting by Louis Francois Cassis. It's a combination of etching and watercolor, and is probably the most detailed and accurate depiction so far. We continue forwards in time to Dominique Vivant de Non's drawing from the 1790s. The age of discovery is finally upon us, and there were actual antiquarians doing real science. Of course, we're still in the very early years of Egyptology. The Rosetta Stone hasn't been discovered yet, and no one can read the hieroglyphics, but the names of kings could at least start to be matched with Greek. So, for the first time in a very long time, Khafre is mentioned. Quote, "Colossal lion with a human head, cut out of the rock guarding the necropolis, which represented the pharaoh Khephren." End quote. Khephren being the Greek name of Khafre. He describes it, quote, "The expression of the head is sweet, pleasing, and tranquil. The character is African, a fineness of execution truly admirable. It is flesh and life. The art has without a doubt a high degree of perfection." End quote. You can tell he's an artist because of his obvious appreciation for the work. You may also notice that while some men are measuring it, there appears to be a man standing in a hole on the head of the Sphinx. We can assume that this hole and the one in its back were carved by treasure hunters in previous centuries. This is a man standing within the hole, showing its approximate depth and width, as well as what it looks like today, covered in a cap and concrete, but it's not a secret tunnel or room. Howard Weiss states that the French excavated down in front of the chest and found a door. There is no writing in French that corroborates this, but this drawing by Lane that I found from the 1820s does seem to show sand removed from the front of it. A possible door between the paws of the Sphinx is commonly repeated by the alternative history people. This is probably where it comes from. But what the French actually probably saw was the dream stela, which certainly looks like this 18th century French-style door that I'm putting next to it to me, especially if it was caked in sand. Now we enter the age of the British archaeologists. The first characters of note being Giovanni Caviglia and Henry Salt. Caviglia was actually an Italian, but Salt financed his work, and he worked for the British consulate, and artifacts were collected by the British Museum. Caviglia, in 1817, was the one who found the small temple at the chest of the Sphinx, as well as the dream stela and the beard, which had fallen away at some point during its slumber in the desert. He also found the Roman staircase used by tourists during that time. This drawing is by Henry Salt in 1817. In 1817, Caviglia also found and excavated the New Kingdom invasive burials in the western cliff of the amphitheater. If you found yourself wondering how we knew things earlier on, the final 200 years of history is the age of discovery and excavations. Salt was also an artist and filled 50 sketchbooks with drawings of Egypt, and really give you an idea for how much sand there actually was covering the Sphinx. It seems most of the work to uncover it started at the front, which is the most obvious point for someone looking for historical context. You might expect a long section on Howard Weiss and John Perring, as with most of my videos, but not this time. Neither man seemed to have much interest in it, likely because they believed it to be solid, and there was nothing major to find inside. But they did check, boring into the back of the Sphinx just behind the head. The drill got stuck at a depth of 9 meters, and Weiss ordered the use of gunpowder to try to dislodge it. Unfortunately, he couldn't, and he left it there, along with the scar from the dynamite. He claimed he wasn't willing to damage the Sphinx to get it out, although it appears his explosive did damage the headdress, as pieces of it were found in the hole when Zahi Hawass excavated and removed the drill in 1978. There was a small effort to clean the chapel between the paws here on the left for 3 months in 1842 through 43. Called the Lepsuix Expedition, which I'm showing on the right. A powerful new technology is about to transform how the world saw the Sphinx: photography. In 1849, this first photograph of the Sphinx is taken by Maxime Ducamp and published in a book of travel photos in 1852. Mariette began to further excavate the Sphinx in September 15, 1853, very close to when this image was drawn by Thomas Seddon in the same year. But very quickly he got demotivated by the sheer quantity of sand to remove and gave up to explore other things. One of the things he would discover would be the Khafre Valley Temple and the inventory stela in the Isis Temple. The inventory stela, claiming a pre-Khufu civilization, shook things up for a bit, but it was very quickly determined to be late kingdom revisionism. But the Sphinx still laid mostly covered. This photograph of it is from Francis Frith in 1856, who is famous for taking the earliest pictures of many landmarks around the world. Mariette didn't forget about the Sphinx, though, and in 1858 he returned to it and removed as much sand as he could, down to the floor, and began finding other artifacts, including a variety of stone chests. You may notice several of these sitting around the Sphinx if you visit today, and it's not completely clear what they even are. Mariette was the first to document them, and he thought they were pedestals for statues. You can see another little box here by the butt. He also began to excavate what he thought was an irregular shaft leading into a cavity in the Sphinx, but quickly realized that what he was uncovering was a natural fissure that had cut down the butt of the Sphinx and is very clear here in this photograph. Felice A. Beato took this photograph in 1860, and you can see that the sands are constantly encroaching. At this point, the Sphinx is basically sitting in the bottom of a pit, with high dunes all around it, constantly trying to fill it back in. But you can see the rump for the first time. While at this time there didn't seem to be any team leading a concerted effort, it seemed the Sphinx naturally started to become uncovered. In this photograph, also from the 1860s, the high dunes from before seem to have flattened out, and much more of the body is now visible. In 1865, this photograph shows it from the temple, photographed by Piazzi Smith. At this time, the sands were actually higher than the walls, and the temple looked more like a hole in the ground than a freestanding building. But in 1880, Mariette returned with a vengeance and determination, and finally, for the first time since the Roman Empire existed, the Sphinx was cleared out in its entirety. But it wouldn't stay that way. Here you can see it partially uncovered, and take a look at the damage to the paw. It looks nothing like today. Maspero, in 1885, as director of the Antiquities Services, once again ordered the Sphinx to be cleared, as a large amount of the work done by Mariette was undone in just 5 years by the sand. Mariette had cleared them for excavation, but didn't bother really creating infrastructure to keep it clear. I believe this photo came from just before Maspero's work was done. We'll round out the 19th century with a photograph from the Tupper scrapbook collection, titled Our Part, December 1892, February 1893. I'm not sure which of those dates this photo was supposed to be from, but you can tell that Egypt mania had come to Europe. But once again, it was not long before the sands of the desert would once again claim the Sphinx. Then in 1909, the Giza Plateau was divvied between 3 groups of archaeologists for the von Sieglin expedition, and a German team took the section containing the Sphinx. While they did some work there, they mostly worked at the Khafre Valley Temple. Then the First World War happened. While there wasn't any fighting around Giza, it was part of the British Empire, and there was fighting at the Suez Canal. Therefore, we get a lot of soldiers posing with it, like here in March of 1920. It wasn't until 1925 when the Department of Antiquities hired Eleme Berets to once again clear the Sphinx and its surroundings, as well as restore it. While there is very little documentation from this excavation, there are 226 photographs of it happening, now in possession of the Centre Vladimir Golenshev in Paris. This is one of them. With most of them dated, we can have a year-by-year breakdown of the clearing attempt, as well as a lot of things they constructed to aid the process. While Reisner says Berets started his work in 1923, it seems the first photograph showing the Sphinx being dug out is from September 25th, 1925. Here is the Roman staircase being excavated and dismantled. I'm not entirely sure what month this is. By mid-October, they'd managed to free the paws again, and they found that the small temple between them had deteriorated significantly since Caviglia had found it. Berets built scaffolding around the head and shored up the headdress with ceramic tiles, limestone slabs, and he poured concrete. In 1926, more of those strange stone boxes were discovered, still believed to have once held statues, but from what time we can't be sure. Likely the late New Kingdom, as there is evidence that the statue on top would have been of the god Osiris. Some of these boxes were taken apart by Berets in order to patch the masonry on the body before rebuilding them where he'd found them. I believe this again was to strengthen everything. In January of that year, he also found the massive mud brick walls the New Kingdom had built to attempt to hold back the sands. I think they probably did their job for a century or so, but there was just so much sand that it took a month to clear it from the foot of the wall. In February, he constructed a new wall of limestone and cement, incorporating the ancient wall to help block the sand from filling the space back in. He then also went to work on the huge fissure on the butt of the Sphinx. It's not clear to me if this butt crack existed in the time of the Old Kingdom and was filled with masonry or something. Based on the excavation, it seemed to have been filled with rubble, but when it was cleared, it created a very ugly scar. This scar, when cleared, was almost 2 meters across. So Berets lined both sides with limestone, then solidified it with concrete. He left the core of it as an open shaft, and an iron trapdoor was placed over it. He then filled the rest of the huge fissure, and the smaller ones that existed, with limestone chips and concrete, which is why the Sphinx has a much more solid look today. At some point in 1926, it's unclear when, Berets found an opening in the rump of the Sphinx. But for some reason, he covered over it with veneer, and it was forgotten about. Don't worry, we'll get back to it.
Hey, you should call that the Sphinxter.
Shut up, invasive thoughts. I'm trying to be serious here. I'm not 100% sure, but I found these photographs that I'm pretty sure show the hole before it was veneered up. Notice how there is a man standing inside of a hole in the ground in the hole, as well as a tunnel that seems to go up. I promise I'll get back to that, but they covered it up and continued their work, and in late 1927, they found the remains of the Sphinx Temple from the 18th dynasty. Some of it had already been found, but this is when it was first fully uncovered. In 1929, Borchardt did a 1:700 scale plan of the site and the stage of excavation. Unfortunately, that's never been published. It was finally in 1930 that the Sphinx Temple was first cleared of sand in likely almost 2,000 years. Here it is from the air in 1934. To the south, behind Khafre's Valley Temple, the team found a large mud brick structure in 1930. In one of the limestone doors was the name Tutankhamun and his queen. These names had actually been plastered over, though, and replaced with Ramses II. They found a hunter's bath and a number of things indicating it may have been a stopover for a hunting party. This building was unfortunately torn down the next year. Berets would continue to work until 1936, when Salim Hassan took over. This is him. By this point, almost all of the Sphinx sanctuary and temple had been cleared out. Hassan found a limestone stela of Amenhotep II on October 20th in what seemed to be a mud brick temple dedicated to him. It's actually not clear to me if it was built during his lifetime or afterwards by his son, because a stela of his son was found to be used as part of the wall. By this time, the connection between Amenhotep and Thutmose was already well established, but finding things like this helped to confirm it, providing physical evidence. The team continued to dig out the area, documenting, then removing mud brick structures as they went. Most of these were clearly just retaining walls, built at various times to try and hold back the sands, but some were also structures. This work concluded in 1938, but it seemed the Sphinx was being maintained at this time. Then the world once again descended into war. You may have seen this ridiculous-looking thing on the Sphinx before and wondered what it was. The image on the right is a Nazi bomber over Giza. The bricks and sandbags under the chin was intended to help protect it during the bombing of Cairo. Then in 1960, the Sphinx actually got an upgrade. While the Sphinx did get some restoration work and reinforcement during the first half of the 20th century, this would mark the first time since the Romans the Sphinx had been enhanced. A few channels were cut into the bedrock to facilitate electric wiring, and the whole place got electric lighting and even a sound system. There is also a complex here at Giza near the Khafre temple with seating, amenities, and just general tourist stuff. That was all built in 1960 and really set off a new wave of Egypt tourism. Here is the great American musician Louis Armstrong playing for his wife in front of the Sphinx. My man has game. In the early 1960s, the famous M&R did a visual survey of the Sphinx and gave us an unusually poor rendering of the Sphinx. Mark Lehner claims in his dissertation that it was clear the two didn't actually measure the Sphinx and drew it in a highly stylized way. In 1965, Herbert Rick performed a detailed survey of the Sphinx Temple, and the Valley Temple. Rick was the one who noticed that the temple was never finished. Finally cleared out and put back together, it was clear that besides the door frames, the entire thing was intended to be cased in granite, but never got it. There was no mortar, no evidence of it ever being there. If you ever wondered how scientists are sure there is nothing underneath the Sphinx, that research was done for the first time in 1978 by SRI International. And things got juicy for a bit because they found stuff. 3 anomalies to be exact. One in front of the paws, and some hits in the northwest section of the sanctuary, as well as one in the middle of the south side behind the elbow of the south paw. They mapped the areas with a resolution of 1 meter squared, which really let them see what's underneath it. It looks like Egyptology is actually finally getting careful, like we are today with scan pyramids, because they first double-checked the results with a different type of acoustic sounding before they were ever allowed to bore into the ground. But 5 drill holes were made, looking at all of the anomalies except for one in the south, because on the sensors it was ill-defined, and likely instead just low-density limestone like here on the left. When cameras were lowered into the spaces, they discovered tiny natural cavities and fissures. I've said it before, Giza is absolutely full of holes. It's just what limestone does when it gets wet. Besides just being natural cavities, they also realized that they were below the water table. The floor of the Sphinx seems very close to it. There is literally no space underneath it for an apartment system of any kind to be carved. Standing water like this is rare, but the water table is usually a few meters under the floor. I'll actually show you the water table itself later. The team took the opportunity, since they already had the boreholes, to lower another type of device known as an acoustic shadow sounder into them. This makes a whole bunch of noise and allows the team to map where echoes do and don't go. They found several places they called blind spots, but further scans with other equipment showed there was nothing there, so they likely saw the boundary of the water table. The team, once again, were also charged with clearing sand from the enclosure. This will likely be a battle that's waged against the desert forever, but the modern technology and tourist dollars does make it a lot easier. Another 1978 excavation was undertaken by Zahi Hawass, who documented the layers of debris from the late and Roman periods, as well as discovering the Old Kingdom invasive burials, and that they had been violated and reused by the Romans. He also then finally removed the bore rod drilled into the back of the neck by Howard Weiss, and discovered that the explosion had in fact damaged the headdress. This is a piece of it right there, which appears in both of these images. I believe it was put back into place with mortar. I mentioned earlier how, according to a study by Mark Lehner, we have a good understanding of where each stone from the temple came from. Here's how he did it. While we usually talk about the layers of limestone of the Sphinx as members 1, 2, and 3, there are almost 40 identifiable geological layers within the Sphinx. Each member is made up of many layers, and the thickness of these layers is not uniform. They undulate all over the place. In the picture of the head, you can see 10 layers labeled. So, where the rock is broken or cut, these layers form obvious lines of strata, which, according to the ARCE, these were mapped in 1978 by Lehner with help from geologist K. Lau Guri, identifying the layers in places where they were obvious and connecting them with tape, it seems, so their positions could be recorded in a grid. It's not clear to me exactly how they identified the layers specifically, but visually should have been good enough. I mean, I can see them in pictures. That work, or at least some of it, was apparently double-checked by a Ulrich Kapp of the German Archaeological Institute in September of 1979. Then, with a profile of the Sphinx enclosure and the lion itself mapped, the strata on each individual stone could be examined and matched to a particular location, fit together like a puzzle with matching lines of strata on both faces. Lehner then published his results, and he dumped some of the data in the ARC Sphinx archive in 2016, but unfortunately not his raw data. That is how, for example, according to Mark Lehner, we know that several of the largest stones in the Khafre monument were not only cut early on, but specifically came from near the head and shoulders, where the largest blocks of the Old Kingdom temple came from near the paws. Here you can see where he claims 2 specific stones came from. There are also lines of strata in the Valley Temple that are continuous for more than 1 block. Here is a prominent example, showing us that they were quarried and immediately put into place. No time for them to get mixed up or out of order. To me, the methodology is flawless. That's exactly how I would have done it. But the process of science fundamentally relies on the idea that others can replicate your results. Everything I've told you about this is taking Mark Lehner's word that he fit the pieces together correctly. If an independent astronomer wants to look at something from a paper using James Webb, they can download raw telescope data. Independent physics nerds can grab and analyze data directly from CERN. Other insiders have referenced Lehner's data, but no one can independently verify it. If I want to try and fit the puzzle pieces together myself, I shouldn't have to go to Egypt with a high-contrast camera if someone's already recorded each piece in detail. This is what History for Granite calls trust me bro archaeology. In 1980, that hole in the rump that Berets found comes back into play. 50 years later, 3 of the workers remembered the hole and led to its rediscovery. All 3 of these men were basket carriers in the 1930s, and I wonder if any of them were in the photographs from before. Oh, the intrusive thoughts 1. Yes, I know it's a juvenile name, but look at it. All right. The sphinxter is a small hole in the middle of the butt that was clearly where masonry was pulled away and exploration tunnels were made. This is a diagram from above on the left and from the side on the right, and the arrow is where the hole to the outside is. You can see that the path from the opening at the base goes down into the ground to the left, as well as up the butt towards the body. It appears the upper part of the tunnel ran into a fissure that went to the outside, as what is currently the roof is modern cement, spilled over from filling the larger crack. All of these images are looking up the tunnel. Oh my god, the butthole even looks like a colonoscopy. It also descends down into the bedrock, again probably looking for treasures or secret spaces. Here you can see before and after excavation, and you can clearly see the exact height of the water table as it filled the bottom a few inches. At the bottom, despite being entirely covered, modern tinfoil, shoes, and a few other things were found in there. I'm not completely sure what they mean by modern, but I think that just means less than 200 years old. The assumption is that this hole is actually a probe dug by one of Howard Weiss's men, despite him not claiming it. We know he did some digging and blasting at the Sphinx, and it's assumed the modern material at the bottom of it was from his expedition. The hole goes nowhere and reaches the water table, as I already showed. For a sense of scale, here's a young Mark Lehner standing inside of it. Today, there is a ladder inside, and with the right price, you can go inside. I've linked a video below if you'd like to see people climb into it. Then, in 1981, they fucked up. Like, royally fucked up. The first thing that happened wasn't their fault. In October, some of the veneer stones on the northern hind paws fell off. And this kicked off a quote-unquote restoration project. You can see when comparing old and new photos that the newer ones seem to show much less dilapidated masonry. Any of my subscribers remember this video? Where I found out that the early Mexican government recased this pyramid in the 1920s, then basically covered it up. All of the archaeological information that gets lost when rebuilding something from scratch. They took the stones off the Sphinx. A huge section of the veneer, ancient blocks of masonry, were removed. A huge amount of the lower masonry around the entire Sphinx was dismantled and replaced with new modern ones. In fact, I must say, the paws there and the new ones just look terrible. Mark Lehner says he took notes and photographs of the process. Gee, thanks, Mark. I'd rather have the stones. They not only replaced stonework, but added some of their own, covering almost the entire bedrock body on the north side, part of the south, and over the rump. This went on for 6 damn years before someone must have had some sense smacked into them, because in 1988 the work was ordered to stop. They had changed the look of the Sphinx too much. It seems they had used much larger stones than those that were originally there, and it was giving it a completely different look. So they wanted to now reverse what they had done. But of course, the original stones were mixed up and most of them were gone. Take a close look at photographs from before 1981 and after. Those are clearly not the same stones. They found or cut new ones. This time, according to Mark Lehner, trying at least to match the pattern that was there prior to 1981. So a lot of these stones that you're looking at are 40 years old, not 4,000. You can clearly see different brickwork pattern here on the paws. Here's a wild swing. The Hall of Records is supposedly an ancient mystical library of Atlantis, located underneath the Great Sphinx. It was dreamed up by clairvoyant Edgar Cayce in the 1920s, and is utter nonsense. But in the 1990s, Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock popularized it. A Dr. Joseph Score was a member of the Cayce's Association for Research and Enlightenment, and was one of the men who believed this, and sponsored, along with the Florida State University, to search for it underneath the Sphinx. At least that was his motivation. Starting to form a plan in 1996, but seemingly getting some pushback from Mr. Hawass. The ARE, with its New Age beliefs, were actually very friendly with officials at Giza, and were said to have even provided support for the 1978 drilling, so this isn't out of left field. FSU's motivation was likely to test their new technology for finding subterranean chambers, and they claim to have been misled about the ARE's motivations. and the Egyptologists' motivations seem to have been to find potential natural cavities under the Sphinx that might be damaging it. In 1998, finally, Zahi Hawass approved the group to drill near the pyramids. When they found nothing, supposedly they were not permitted to drill any further. However, it appears that at some point he was convinced to drill 2 holes under the Sphinx looking for the Hall of Records. I have a contact who was personally told by Mr. Hawass that's where these came from, and they're near the rear paw where the anomalies were found in 1978. Thanks again, Aviometrics LLC, for the images and some of the information. I have been able to verify most of all of it, and well, the boreholes are right there, so it's pretty obvious this happened. I'm fairly confident Mr. Hawass knew they would find nothing, and was more interested in the geology and FSU's technology. The public interest in the Hall of Records also appears to have been the motivation for Hawass to pump out and explore the Osiris shaft, which I'm showing you. So Mr. Hawass occasionally seems to play into the alternative history if they're willing to pay up for some expeditions where he can get some real science done on the side. Kinda respect that. Well played. The most recent work done at the Sphinx was again a restoration job, attempting to reverse damage from previous restorations. While concrete is a very good way to hold rock together, the Sphinx is a living rock, still one big chunk of limestone that's in the bedrock, and it needs to be able to breathe, and concrete prevents that. A lot of the focus of the work was towards the neck and head and chest because that's what's most visible to tourists, obviously. I believe this was completed in 1998. Let's jump to 2009, when a few more boreholes were drilled. Like before, I believe they were simply examining what's under it, looking for a danger to the monument. The work specifically looked at the water table and groundwater. You can watch the actual drilling yourself from this YouTube link below. The Egyptian Antiquities Authority have thankfully been helping to control the water table, occasionally drilling elsewhere to release groundwater, as it seems to be rising and presenting a danger to the Sphinx. It seems likely there were many times throughout history when the Sphinx enclosure may have actually been full of water. Likely not on purpose, and when open, I don't think it's watertight. But when full of sand, water could exist here in a standing form, and in my opinion is why the lower terraces are eroded so badly. Like the pyramids that surround it, the Great Sphinx is a very popular tourist attraction, and will be for the foreseeable future. There is still, of course, plenty of research being done by academics and independent researchers, but now it all takes place in academic settings and online, not in the field. As far as we can tell, all of the major mysteries of the Great Sphinx have been solved, and I hope you've enjoyed this video of all of it. So there it is, 56 million years of history compressed into a 90-minute presentation. I hope I didn't miss anything, but it's entirely possible that I did. For information about things that I missed, the best place for that is below in the comments section. I have a lot of very clever people in my comment section, some of which are actual Egyptologists. And if I make a mistake and someone corrects it, I tend to pin that comment. Thank you for listening. Respectfully post your own thoughts below on the Great Sphinx, and subscribe if you wish to continue to join me in exploring the enigmas of our distant ancestors.